Hello. So today we're going to begin our introduction to persuasive writing. This is just an introduction to let you know some of the basics. This is not a how-to video. We will do how to write persuasively integrated throughout the course as we move on. So I promise you from the bottom of my heart, this will be the only time that I reference ancient philosophers, but this is where persuasive writing started. Started with pathos, ethos, and logos. So pathos is basically persuasion through the use of emotion and sympathy. You can use pathos by using meaningful language, emotional tones, giving emotion-evoking examples, using stories with emotional events and implied meanings. So if you go back to the introductory video when we talked about the poodle being hit by the car, you will notice that at one point, one of the examples said, swerved in an effort to avoid killing the animal. So they were adding pathos in there or emotion in there to help persuade. The next is ethos. Ethos is persuading through the authority of the author or you. You can use ethos by choosing appropriate language for the audience or appropriate language for the topic. Considering you are writing persuasively for law, you want to make sure that you sound fair. You also want to make sure that you sound like you're an authority. So this is where you have to be careful with your grammar and your syntax. And you have to be careful with your language. Your paper, if somebody is reading this, since it's persuasive writing, needs to look persuasive. So it can't have a whole lot of typos. Formatting has to be set. There can't be anything distracting. Your citations need to be correct so that you have credibility. Ethos is using your credibility. And then finally, logos is persuasion through logic and facts. You use logos in the law by citing cases, by doing advanced and well-reasoned arguments, and by using analogy. That should sound a little bit familiar considering you've spent a semester doing analogic reasoning. So when you are writing to persuade, there's some factors you need to consider. First factor you want to consider is your audience. Who is your audience? We talked about this just a tad last week. But at least for your pretrial memo, your audience is a trial judge. Trial judges need to know what the law is. They are bound by a higher authority or a higher court. Trial courts can't change the law. Trial courts are bound by the appellate court they sit under, and then the higher court that appellate court sits under. So trial courts, when they decide cases, they are less concerned about setting precedent. They are more concerned with following the law. So you need to make sure you make clear what the law that the court has to follow is. When you get to appeals, then you can now worry about having a court make a rule. But at a trial level, you are more concerned with them following established law. Remember that trial courts focus on what law governs the outcome of the case, given the facts of your case, especially if there are disputed facts in your case. Also remember the trial judges are really busy. They have very full dockets. They are also not experts on your area of law, especially when you get into a federal court context. This is not like you're arguing a DUI in front of a judge that sits in DUI court, right? Federal judges do everything from simple motions to suppress to RICO actions to IRS actions, all sorts of things. So they are not an expert most of the time on any of the law that's going in front of them. So you want to make sure that you are very thorough when preparing your argument and that you are very clear, because the simpler it is for the judge to understand, the clearer you will be making your point and the more logos you will be using because you are um, being logical to the court. Another factor you should consider is the authority. This is somewhat related to audience, but authority, one, has to do with you being authority, two, has to do with the authority that you're using to support your argument. So remember, as I just said, the trial court is bound by a higher authority, being the mid-level appellate court that it sits in front of, and the court that has jurisdiction over the mid-level court. So you want to make sure, especially when you're talking about your rules, that you're using rules from higher authority. How strong is that authority? And finally, you also want to consider the theory of the case or the theme of the case. A theory of the case or a theme is basically a nutshell of why your client should win. This should be introduced in your introduction sentence that I talked about in your introduction to the pretrial memo, and it should then be carried throughout the rest of your document, bringing the reader back to that theory or that theme often. So let's talk about these one by one. Audience. You have really spoken to different audiences most of your life. So if you imagine that you were a 9-year-old child who wants a later bedtime on a Saturday night, how do you persuade different folks? So if you were trying to persuade your 14-year-old sibling who was babysitting you that night, perhaps you would say something like, I will let your boyfriend or girlfriend come over and not tell mom and dad. Or I will wash the dishes for you for a week if you let me stay up late. But that's much different than if you're trying to convince a college student that has no relation to you, that was hired by your parents to babysit, and what you would say to them. Now, again, you might say, hey, I'll let you call your boyfriend or go in the pool with your boyfriend or your girlfriend if you let me stay up late. Or you might use the other half of that. I will tell mom and dad that last time that you babysat, you had your boyfriend over and you didn't pay any attention to me, right? Could be good, could be bad, but you would use something like that to convince the person to let you stay up late. And finally, if you were trying to convince your parents to let you stay up late, you could say something like, this is very important to me. I promise that I will go to bed at 8 o'clock the rest of the week. I promise that I will do all my chores and double chores if you let me stay up tonight. Things like that. But those, remember, you have to keep in mind who you were talking to and speak to that person or that audience. Now let's talk a little bit about authority. So part of authority, again, is for you to sound like an authority. To that end, don't use a big word when a singularly unloquacious and diminutive linguistic expression will satisfactorily accomplish the contemporary necessity. Yeah. Some people think that that sounds flashy and that sounds important and that actually gives you authority. It doesn't. It makes you sound like an ass. Don't use big words unless it's the only word that's around. Try to speak as plainly and simply as you can. I'm not saying that you dumb down and talk to somebody like they're 3 or 4, but you don't need to find big words or use a thesaurus to write with authority in legal writing. Write plainly using plain English so that you can get your point across, especially when you're writing to somebody who's busy that doesn't have the time to figure out whether or not you've used a word properly. So compare these two statements. A reasonable adult in plaintiff's position would recognize that the attempt to execute a head-first straight dive into the lake without prior awareness of the depth of the waters might result in severe injury from the collision of one's head on the lake bottom. Compare that to a reasonable adult like the plaintiff would know that if he dove straight down and head first into a lake without knowing how deep the water was, he could hit his head on the lake bottom and become paralyzed. Which sentence do you think speaks with more authority? I will tell you that I think that the second one does. Why? Because I knew exactly what was being referred to, exactly what was being talked about without having to think about it. It was very clear to me what was going on. I didn't have to stop. And that is speaking with authority. So when you want to write with authority, the first way that you write with authority is to use plain English. The second is that you write with a well-organized argument. Then you can also adopt a persuasive writing style. When you adopt a persuasive writing style, there are certain tricks that you will learn, but we're going to start with one that's pretty easy, which is exploiting positions of emphasis. What does that mean? Well, exploiting positions of emphasis is just how the human mind works. People pay attention to things that are closer to the blank or the white spaces on a piece of paper. So, the beginning of a paragraph, the beginning of a subsection, the beginning of a paper. People tend to lose interest when they get to page 6 or 7. The reason that we break up writing into subsections, that we break up writing into different parts, like a question presented and an answer and a facts, and we separate them, is that people pay attention when there's been a break. So you want to exploit, and what do I mean by exploit? Meaning you want to put your most important stuff where the reader is going to be paying the most attention in those spaces that have the white space. So that would be the beginning and the end of every paragraph, the beginning and the end of the document. That's where the readers pay the most attention. That's why hooks are important. That's why points of analysis are important. They are the beginnings of paragraphs. That's why point headings are important. They are the beginnings of discussions or arguments. And also, you persuade with your large-scale organization. When you're doing your large-scale organization and when you are arranging your argument, you want to start with your strongest point first if you have a multi-issue argument. Your book starts talking about the organization of a single legal argument. It is really good. Read it. And also, especially for those of you that haven't taken LSV in a while, section 3.2 of your textbook discusses how to structure an analogical argument. It's good. It would be a wonderful review for you. And considering everybody's just getting off break, it would probably be a wonderful review for everybody to go back and look at section 3.2 of this An Advocate Persuades textbook. Finally, let's talk a little bit about themes or theories of the case. So what is it? It's a unifying idea that quickly and simply explains why the court should rule in your client's favor. It takes the law and your facts and puts them together in a way that justifies out loud to the court why you should win. It's also a simple way to remember the case. So it's probably beyond most of your years, but you may have seen it on YouTube. Way back when there was the O.J. Simpson trial, Johnny Cochran came up with the, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And that was when O.J. was trying on gloves that the prosecutors said he was wearing so that he wouldn't leave fingerprints. Right? So that was very quick, very catchy. Themes are not always quick and catchy. Sometimes they're much more subtle. But it's the idea of putting something in action down. So it goes in your introduction and then it goes throughout your argument so that the court can remember it. And then you can use it again at different points of the case. You could start it during motion practice and then you could use it in your opening argument if the case goes to trial. You could use it in your closing argument, etc. How do you get there? Well, you need to develop a theme. Again, remembering that a theme is a cohesive and compelling narrative for the court. You look for themes in different places. So you can look for themes in the procedural legal standard. So if you were doing an appeal, which we will get to later in the semester, it can be something as simple as a trial court did not abuse its discretion. It could be something as simple here that there was no probable cause, but a procedural legal standard. You could also look at an underlying policy, a policy that underlines the law. We talked to you a lot about including policies in your discussion and now in your argument. Well, policy can sometimes really help you. There are policies underlying the Fourth Amendment and why the courts want to abide by the Fourth Amendment and make sure that a citizen's rights are not violated under the Fourth Amendment. Might be an interesting place to look for a theme for your case. Also, finally, you can look at for a theme where a social good or a value is at stake. Freedom is a value that people look at often. I want you to know that themes are more likely to be accepted when they're based on concepts that aren't in dispute, where it's not something that the other side can say, oh, that didn't happen here. Also know that lawyers develop themes at different times. I don't think that you can sit down, look at your pretrial simulation right now and say, oh, I see a theme, right? It depends on the facts or the circumstances of the case. Oftentimes, a theme doesn't come out until you've researched the law and you've developed your arguments already. And as you're writing, you will see yourself using words or ideas over and over. That would be a theme. Do not worry if a theme is not immediately evident to you. Just remember that a theme must be consistent with both the law and the facts to the argument. I think it's chapter 6 of your book has an entire chapter on themes for persuasive arguments, and it was part of your reading for this week. So go back and review that. We talked about themes a little bit in the introduction to the pretrial memo when I read some of the introductions to you. Those are actually introducing themes. So here's one. This is a case about a primary election. Members of one political party alleged that they had a right to participate in the other political party's primary election. And the attorney for elections was arguing that plaintiffs were incorrectly arguing Florida law. So he opened his brief with the following. In demanding to participate in a primary election for a party they concede they do not belong to and therefore have no right to associate with, plaintiffs fundamentally misconstrue the United States and Florida constitutions. This theme is based on substantive law. It's based on no right of association. Plaintiffs of one political party had no right to associate with the other political party. This attorney also appealed to social policy by using some good language like concede. So they admit that they don't belong to the party, and fundamentally misconstrue, which means that a court can't abide by it because courts are not supposed to misconstrue the law. And finally, here's another case. It doesn't even matter what the case is about, but it was improper interference with a uniquely political function. And again, this showed up in the introduction to the brief. Plaintiffs improperly invite this court to wade into the uniquely political and discretionary decision-making process of funding a separate sui juris governmental entity, the Value Adjustment Board. Another point your book makes that's worth paying attention to, which I just made a couple of slides ago, is you don't necessarily arrive at your theme at the outset. Johnny Cochran did not have, if it does not fit, you must acquit at the opening statement. That wasn't until he got to his clothing. So you have to do analysis. You have to read your cases. You have to understand what's going on before you can get to a theme. And on that and your introduction to persuasive writing, I say thank you, and next video will be coming up soon. Have a good one.